Hey guys, welcome back to Tabletop Glory. My name is Graham Johnson, and today we're going to be talking about the things that got left out of other videos, whether it be because I thought it was common knowledge or it got cut for time, whatever the case is. Today we're going to be answering your questions. Before we get started, thank you to this wonderful person for giving some wonderful and awesome ideas for today's video. In any case, let's talk about what got forgotten. So there are two main types of palettes that we tend to use in miniature painting. That's hard palettes and wet palettes. Now, they all come in different shapes and sizes, and in today's tutorial, we're going to be mainly focusing on hard palettes. The reason for this is that the techniques that we're going to be displaying today can be done on both a hard palette and a wet palette. And I want to show you guys who are just getting started that you don't need a fancy wet palette to do all the same stuff. We're also going to be using water today as our medium instead of using one of the fancy mediums that I typically tend to use, like an airbrush medium. And the reason for that, again, is the same reason. I want to show you guys who are just getting started that anybody can do this. Now we're going to be using this Space Marine Captain as a test figure, and we're going to be using Rhinotide because it's going to be a really great way to kind of show the differences in the thickness of the paint because it's super pigmented and all that good stuff. So we're going to give the paint a good shake here real quick, and we're just going to put a big old dollop of it on our brush. Now this is just to show you why it's not a necessarily great idea to paint directly out of the pot. Now if you do scrape it off and try to keep as little in the brush as possible, you can kind of get away with things. But you'll notice that it's just kind of gumming up the details, and I'm really having to manipulate it and push it around a lot. You really shouldn't have to do that. If you thin it down a little bit with just a bit of water, then it should be just fine. Now I'm going to show you how I thin down my paints. So we're just going to put a dollop of Rhinotide right there on the middle of our palette, and then what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and clean off the brush. Now this is to stop paint from going up into the furrow. However, you don't want to use a fully loaded brush full of water. So we're just going to lightly dab it on the paper towel. That's going to soak off all the excess, but it's going to leave plenty of water in the brush. Now starting off of the paint, working in a circular motion, we're going to work our way into the paint. You'll see how it kind of starts to blend in with that water quite quickly, and then we just give it all a good blend. You'll see how it's sticking together. It's not really running around on the palette. That's a good sign that you've mixed your paints properly. Now let's take a look at what that looks like when we apply it to the model. You'll notice that it looks a little bit thin, and you will have to do a second coat doing this. However, by thinning our paint in this manner, what that does is it allows us to get a nice smooth coat, and by putting on 2 or 3 thin coats of this style of thinned down paint, it's going to give us a really smooth finish, and it's going to give us a really matte finish. So now what I'm doing is a technique known as flooding, and sometimes you want to flood your palette. However, that's a bit of an advanced technique that kind of falls in line with washes and glazes. But this is basically to simulate what happens when you put way too much water on your palette. And you can see here as I apply it to the miniature, it's just kind of following gravity, it's sticking into the recesses, it's not really coating the model. Now this can be an effect that you may want, especially when it comes to weathering your miniature. However, if you're trying to base coat or highlight, you can see that it's just not sticking. Now if you have an issue like beading, where the paint is beading up on the surface and it's not even sticking to it at all, that could be something like mold release still being on your model, and you may need to lightly wash your model first before you try to paint it. Now I want to go ahead and give you a quick example of how I blend colors together, whether I'm doing a 2-color blend like this or if I'm adding multiple colors. We're just going to show you how I do that on the hard palette, and then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to talk about how I would think about mixing colors and how I determine which colors need to be mixed to get the color I want. So we're just going to go ahead and put some Cantor Blue down on the palette, get a nice big dollop, and we're going to do the same thing with the Everland Sunset. Now the reason we do 2 separate dollops instead of just going ahead and mixing them instantly on the palette is we may decide that we want to mix a little bit more of the darker or lighter colors in later on to do highlights or shadows, and it just stops you from having to go get more paint out of the pot later. Now depending upon whether you want a brighter or darker color, you need to blend whatever end of the spectrum you want into the other one. So like if I wanted a super bright vibrant green, I would mix the yellow into the blue. Or if I want a nice dark green like we've done here, Obviously you can see I started with the blue and mixed into the yellow, and then I'm just adding more yellow till I end up with the color I want. Now, it's important to keep in mind other colors can go into your blending to end up with the color you want. So like if I wanted a super vibrant lime green, I would take the green we ended up here with and maybe add some white or a super vibrant yellow to it to kind of end up in that spectrum. If you're new to miniature painting, you want to go ahead and get your hands on a color wheel. Now, the one I have is a physical copy. However, there are many online to choose from that are absolutely free. I highly recommend you go find a nice large one on Google, download it to your phone so that you have it available to you, and that way you can kind of zoom in and get a better look at it. Now, they do make color wheels with way more options of colors than what you see here, meaning that the value from darkest to lightest will show you way more colors than what I have, but this is just a really good teaching example to kind of get myself pointed in the right direction, and works really well for me because of my color blindness. So in the example we did, we mixed yellow into blue. Now if I wanted a specific shade of green, I can just look at what is the closest to that and then kind of mix my blues and yellows ahead of time and then mix them together to get the green that I want. Or perhaps if I've started mixing my blues and yellows and I don't quite understand why I'm not getting the green that I want, I can look at some of the other surrounding colors and figure out what I need to blend in to get closer. Perhaps if my green was a little too dark, I'd realize I need to add a little bit more yellow or perhaps a bit more white to brighten things up. It's really important in miniature painting to have a good understanding, or at least down the road to have an understanding of primary, secondary, and tertiary colors. Now, I am not a good person to explain this because of my color blindness. However, I can recommend the art channel Jazza. Jazza is a really awesome artist and he does some killer work, and he's done a lot of really great videos on explaining color theory as well as what is a primary color, what isn't a primary color, and then how to mix your colors. And I really recommend checking him out, as he's also just recently rebooted his TableTop channel and he's painting miniatures on there as well. So I'll put a link to both of those here in the video. Now, before I get a little too farther into today's video, I want to go ahead and talk about brush care while painting. A lot of times in live streams, people ask me, how do you get your brushes to last so long? I suspect a lot of people's brushes look like the yellow one. Now, the small one with the good tip on it is actually about 6 months old, and it's a really cheap brush that only cost me about $1. So how did I get it to last that long? Let's talk about it. Now, I'm just using water so you can see what's going on, but if you were mixing with your paint, you can see I'm using a twisting motion to kind of pull paint up and off the palette. This is what I do to help keep a good tip on it while I'm working on miniatures to make sure I can get all those good details. But what about when we start cleaning, when you go to actually wash out your brush? What I suspect a lot of people are doing is when they get to their paper towel, they're just kind of mashing the brush around and cleaning it out, and that's what's destroying your brush. You want to be just as gentle when cleaning it as you are while painting. So by cresting the brush in between your two forefingers, you're going to be able to apply pressure and kind of wrap the paper towel around the brush. And with that same twisting motion that we collect paint off the palette with, we're going to wipe the brush clean. Now, if you need to kind of scrub it a little bit, you should do a circular motion, similar to how we do when we mix paint. But that's what's going to help keep your brush good for as long as possible and make a really expensive brush last a lifetime. Now, in last week's video, we talked about how to break down an airbrush all the way and clean it, but I was asked to show a way of cleaning the airbrush where you don't have to do a full breakdown. So you can see me here, I'm using my makeup sponge, I'm pinching off the tip of the airbrush, and I'm creating backflow. And what that's doing is it's forcing any pigment that's trapped inside the airbrush to go back up into the color cup, where I can dump it out and then run some cleaner through it. Now, I will do this in between colors when switching from one color to the next when I'm not done with my project, and I do this as many times as it takes until I can get as little to zero pigment coming back out of my airbrush as possible. You'll see that even when it looks like it's running clear out of the front of the airbrush, we're still getting color to back up into the cup. So it's important to clean as thoroughly as possible. So washes and glazes apparently are a bit of a tricky subject, and although I wouldn't have normally considered myself to be an expert on the subject, I do have a firm understanding of the difference between what a wash and a glaze is. So specifically, a wash is meant to settle in the recesses and to darken up those recesses. It's not really meant to coat an entire surface to help with blending or to change the overall tone of a piece of armor or whatever it is that we happen to be painting on. Now with a glaze, it's not really meant to settle in the recesses. However, you could build up some layers to give the illusion it's done so, to mimic a wash. But a glaze is a little bit of a thicker pigment paint. It's also thicker in body, and it's really meant to just cover the entire surface, to add a tint or a slight change in the color. Typically what we use glazes for is kind of blending transitions together and to make our model look a little bit more seamless, or to perhaps even add a little pop of color to something. A really good example of this is when we try to paint either fire effects and we try to put a little bit of a glow on the surrounding area. Typically you can do that with a wash, but you're basically doing the act of glazing when you do that. You're not trying to get that color to settle in the recesses, you're trying to paint the overall surface. Now when it comes to making them from scratch, they're kind of done in the same way, especially when using water as opposed to other mediums. Similar to how we thinned out our paints at the start of this video, we're going to be slowly introducing more water and reducing the amount of pigment, and that's going to allow us to have more control over what it looks like when we apply it to our model. Understand that the more water you're adding, the more coats you're going to need to add to build up whatever effect you're trying to achieve. Now in my case here, I'm adding a little bit of purple to our red because the piece I'm wanting to tint, or in this case I'm trying to wash, is originally based in that same red. Once you're happy with the color you've blended out to create for your wash or your glaze, you may decide you want to separate some of it out into a different part of your palette like I'm doing. What this is going to do is it's going to allow you to add a little bit more water without fear of ruining your entire batch. You can just basically experiment around with how much water versus how much pigment you want and determine how quickly you want your glaze or your wash to change the color of the surface of whatever you're applying it to. This is going to give you a lot more control, and it's going to act more like a safety net. Typically, if you're doing this for a glaze, there shouldn't need to be any cleanup. You're just applying it to the area you want to change the color of. However, if you're doing this as a wash, you may want to clean up certain areas so that your wash stays strictly in the recesses. Apply a very thin coat of the original color, in this case red, across the area that you don't want changed. So anywhere where my purple wash has gotten where I didn't want it, I'm just going to clean it up with a bit of red, and that's going to leave it in the recesses. Now, if you've been watching a lot of YouTube trying to learn more about miniature painting, and especially my channel as well, you've probably heard a lot of us using the term layering. What exactly is layering? What does it mean? And how do you do layering? So layering strictly refers to the number of layers or adding of layers of paint to create whatever effect we're going for. So in the case of the figure that we just did, the little backpack, we layered up multiple layers of glazes and washes to create the effect we wanted in the recesses. Now a lot of times this can also refer to doing object source lighting or other things like that, or if we wanted to put some kind of an ethereal glow coming off of a weapon, we may add some kind of a light layer of some other color in the direction to indicate that whatever that character is holding is giving off some kind of light. Now layering can also be simply just building up colors on armor to give the illusion that sunlight is coming from a specific direction, casting shadows on the opposite side of the miniature. How do we think about lighting so that we know where to put these layers? Well, let's talk about it. Typically for me, when I'm picking a light source on painting a miniature, I paint my minis similar to this, where the light source is to give the illusion of directly above and slightly in front of the miniature. This allows me to kind of make sure that the face has full detail on it, and I can put highlights kind of all around the miniature. Sometimes I may put highlights in places that don't quite make sense, and I refer to these as heroic highlights. This is just kind of a way to make it so that the model looks interesting as you rotate it all the way around. But if you're wanting a more natural, more realistic approach, just ignore that. Now, for those of you who have a hard time visualizing your light source and how it interacts with your miniature, you may want to consider trying to use a flashlight, whether it be from your cell phone or just buying a small little pocket flashlight to direct light at your miniature before you paint it. And if you really need it as a reference, you just take a photo with your phone. If you're going to take a photo with your phone, I recommend using a pocket flashlight, so that way you can capture that detail from more extreme angles so you can really see where your shadows and your highlights are. This is a really great way for when you're first getting started to really have a good understanding of where that light is coming from and how it interacts with your miniature. And this is going to give you a really good understanding of where to put all of your highlights. And we're just going to wrap things up with a quick Q&A. Number 1, how do you know when to use an airbrush, when not to use an airbrush? My personal opinion is to use an airbrush as early on in the project as possible, and then to switch to brush painting for probably the last 2/3 worth of your project. You want to use your airbrush to build up all the basic shapes of your highlights as well as all of your base tones. You're not really using it for any kind of real extreme detail. Now, you can end up using your airbrush a little bit toward the end to kind of build up some shadows and things like that by spraying a little bit of wash through your airbrush just to kind of do a bit of a transparent layer to add to the effect that you want. And number 2, can you use washes through an airbrush? Well, like I just said, yes, you can use a wash through an airbrush, and you can create a large range of effects based on how much wash you allow to run through the airbrush onto a single spot on the model, which will determine basically whether it's a nice thin layer very similar to a glaze or whether it'll act more like a traditional wash. Now, for some visual examples of that, we'll be doing that in our next video, as I'm going to be working on a model of the Millennium Falcon. It's a rather large model. I'm about 6'2", and my hands are quite large, and the Millennium Falcon is bigger than my hand. In fact, the main section, the saucer section of the Millennium Falcon, is almost the same size as my hand. So there's a lot of really awesome detail that we're really going to be able to use to push that airbrush to its max, so you can see how you can use an airbrush to speed up the painting process on a large model, as well as doing a lot of weathering techniques and things like that that we normally wouldn't get the opportunity to do on smaller models. So I hope you guys will catch us for that one. Now, I will say that this video is not going to be coming out for next week like we normally would, as with the holidays I'm going to be taking a small break to spend time with family. I hope you guys will understand, and we'll get back in it as soon as possible. Thank you guys so much for watching today. I really appreciate it, and hopefully you guys learned a lot. As always, if you have ideas for future episodes, go ahead and post them in the comments below, and I'll try to include as many of them as I can during this Millennium Falcon project, as I get a feeling that this is going to take multiple episodes to get done. In any case, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.